For our next story, we've shifted. We're now down in the Haws of Bervie, right next to the river. Inverbervie is called Inverbervie because it's built on the mouth of the river. There's lots of invers around Scotland if you have a look. It's a nice thing to do. For this next story, I have had to do so much investigation, and one of the things I was so glad of was that in the UK there is a census, and a census is a count of who is where and when, and it doesn't matter where you are, you will be part of that census. And apparently the one in Scotland is going to be happening next year, will be part of that census, and it will take note of where you are in a certain place at a certain time. And in the future, that might help people like me to find out things about you. Way back in Bervie, fishing was the main occupation because the river was open to the sea and a natural harbour had formed, and in it fishing boats and also slightly bigger vessels could manage to anchor. But gradually, as the Haws built up with mills, sediment began to move down the river, blocking up the mouth, and also the spit from the south side began to creep over until it was no longer suitable for ships to go in and anchor. And the fisher folk, well, they just moved down the road to Gourdon. For Gourdon had a brilliant wee harbour built by Thomas Telford in 1820, and it was a hive of activity. But in the town of Bervie itself, there was plenty going on. All over the UK, there was a material that was becoming more important than wool. It was called linen, and linen was made from flax, and flax had to be imported from abroad and was made of fibres that when they were broken down and spun, they made the most beautiful thread. And that thread was taken by weavers and woven into beautiful clothing, napkins, tablecloths. I brought you one of those tablecloths. This was my mother's. It's actually an Easter tablecloth. I had many things made of linen that were my mother's. It was a very popular fabric. And so in the town of Bervie, there were lots and lots of individual families who would have spinning wheels in their houses. They would have big weaving looms. And at the market, the spinners would bring their thread and the weavers would buy it. The weavers would make shirts, they would make all kinds of things for the house, and then they would sell that at market or send it off in carts to go elsewhere to the rich houses. But there were enterprising people who were constantly thinking bigger and bigger and how to make more money. And so it was in 1787 that the very first flax mill in Scotland was built. There was 40 spinning frames inside. There was a mill wheel in the water, and it spun round and round, and it gave power to those spinning frames. 50 people were employed at that time, and then another flax mill was built here, employing more people. And as that happened, the town began to grow. And once that flax was spun, the weavers would make it into beautiful things that could be sold here and abroad. This is the old brig of Bervie. It was built at a very strategic time for the town. That was when everything was just beginning to kick off. The mills were starting to be built. There was a need to be able to traverse the river instead of having to ford it. When this bridge was built, it enabled commerce to really begin to flow up and down the coast in a very different way. It was built with storage facilities in it for grain, although some folks say that it was used as holding cells for miscreants who needed to be sent to Montrose or Aberdeen for trial. But your guess is as good as mine whether that's true or not. And it lasted a long time. In 1935, a new bridge was built, the Jubilee Brig. And it's a straighter bridge, but I still like the old one. In the town, there was a family called Linton, and lint is another name for flax. Alex Linton was a very good weaver, and he hoped that his sons would follow suit. But his eldest, Alex, had decided, nah. The Napoleonic Wars had just happened, and so many young men were thinking about ships and the sea. And he decided to become a shipbuilder. His brother, the same, and his other brother joined the Merchant Navy. Now, Alex had fallen in love with a lassie. She was the clockmaker's daughter. Her name was Jane Anderson. They got married and they moved all the way up to the Murray coast. This was in 1737. And they took their little son with them, Hercules. He was born in his grandfather's house in Inverbervie, and then as a wee one, taken all the way up to Findhorn. That was where shipbuilding was just beginning. It was already a very busy little port with lots of ships coming and going. Hercules' earliest toys were probably a hammer and a chisel and pieces of wood to whittle away at. But when it came time for schooling, Hercules was the only son in that family, and Grandfather Anderson, the clockmaker, said to his daughter, "I'm willing to put Hercules into private school in Arbuthnot if you bring him down here to stay." And so it was. Hercules came and lived with his grandparents in Inverbervie. And every day he would travel up the road to Arbuthnot to Dr. Crystal's private school for boys. And he stayed there all his primary years. There's a story his daughter tells of one day he was coming back and the snow was up to his thighs, and he heard this cry, and he looked over and there was the postmaster. He was buried in the snow. He'd been collecting mail from all the farms and he was exhausted. He could go no further. And so Hercules hoisted all the mail on his own back and helped the postmaster back into town. And the postmaster was ever grateful to the young lad. Now, staying with his grandfather, Hercules got really interested in clocks and decided that maybe this was for him to become a clockmaker. But his father had other ideas. His father moved to Arbroath with the family, and Hercules went to join them, and there he went to high school. And when he finished, his father said, "Now, Hercules, I have got an apprenticeship for you in Aberdeen. You're going to join Alexander and Sons to become a shipbuilder." Well, you had to do as you were told. And so Hercules travelled all the way up to Aberdeen. Took a lot longer than it does today, probably by coach. And for 4 years he learned about ships. And you know, when he first arrived and saw these huge, gorgeous ships, he was totally overcome. Clockmaking went out of his head, and he thought, I want to design something beautiful. Alexander and Sons were known for their sharp bows of their ships, and Hercules learned all about that. He was very diligent. He didn't muck about with his apprenticeship. Some others did, but by the end of his time there, he was given a position in the company. And a year later, he was a senior. Now, his father really wanted him to become a Lloyd's surveyor. What that meant was that you went round checking that every ship was suitable for going to sea. Although it was good to learn about these things, that wasn't what Hercules wanted. But he decided to go into training, and it was down in Liverpool. But in between leaving Aberdeen and going to Liverpool, he came back to Bervie to be with his extended family. And he spent a few weeks here. And in May, there was always an annual fair. And his cousin said, there's going to be a dance after the annual fair. You have to come. Oh, no, said Hercules, I'm not. You used to dance your feet off. You'll remember. Well, they cajoled and dragged him along that night. And you know, he was very glad he did. For there, sitting on the other side of the room, was a bonny lassie, and her name was Marjorie Anderson. She was from over the river, from a place called King's Horney. She was only 14, training to become a lady's maid. Hercules sat down beside her, and they hardly danced all night. They were too busy yattering. And he was able to tell her all his dreams. He felt so comfortable with her. And when he left Bervie, there was a special place in his heart for Marjorie. And within a couple of years they were engaged, and by the time he'd finished his training in 1865, they got married. And by that time, the trains had come to Bervie. And so he and Marjorie set off to their new home by train, down to Montrose, joining the main line and going to Newcastle. And in Newcastle, he met a man called Scott Moncrieff. Now, he was one of these fellas whose father had money, so he had money, none that he'd earned off his own bat, and it went through his fingers like water. But his ears pricked up when he heard about Hercules' dream to be designing his own ships. I could pay for that, Hercules, he said. We could go into business together. Well, Hercules was a canny man, and he said, I'll think about it. They didn't spend long in Newcastle. They moved to Lanarkshire, by this time with 2 children, and there he began designing his own boats for the first time. They were yachts. He had a yard in Glasgow. But Scott was at his lug the whole time. Come on, Hercules, we can do this. Well, he did. He persuaded Hercules. And so they set up a company called Scott and Linton Shipbuilders. And they had a yard on the River Leven by Dumbarton. And they began to get orders for boats. But it was the 5th order that was to change Hercules' life. There was a man called White Hat Willis. He was the son of a shipbuilder, and he was a very ambitious business head. Now, during this time in 1868, a ship had been built in Aberdeen called the Thermopylae. She was a tea clipper, for this was the time when tea had just come to Britain. And it had to be transported from China to London, which was a very long voyage, but whoever got there first got a lot of dosh. And it was Willis's desire to have a tea clipper built that could beat the Thermopylae. When Hercules heard what Willis wanted, he said to him, I'm your man. I can build a ship. It'll cut through water like a knife. Ah, said Willis, is that the case? And how much would this ship cost me? Well, Hercules decided it was better to go on the cheap side to try and bring Willis in. So he said, £17 per tonne. That's not a bad price. Okay, £17 per tonne. I want it built within 6 months. It's January now. I want it built by July. Done, said Hercules. 6 months is no time to build a ship. But Hercules was so longing to build the ship of his dreams that he agreed. And, said Willis, if the ship is late, you will pay £5 a day for every day it is overdue. Hercules swallowed at that, but he said, very well. And, said Willis, the Captain Moore, he's going to tell you what materials to make the ship from. I want the very, very best materials for this ship. Agreed, said Hercules. But those materials had to come from abroad. The base was made of elm from Canada. The side plankings were made of teak coming from East India. The decking had to come from Burma. Now, I've no idea how long that would take, but time was ticking, and by July the ship was not built. By September, the money was gone. Scott had taken a hike, and unfortunately, Hercules had to say, "I cannot finish your ship, Willis." So the contract was handed over the river to the Denny brothers, and they came over to the yard and they finished building this superb ship. She was built by November, and the lines, oh, Hercules, although he was now without a penny to his name, he looked at this ship in delight and awe, and he knew she was going to be the fastest on the water. Willis and Hercules had met and chatted about the name of the ship. What figurehead do you reckon we should have on this gorgeous number 5? For that was what the ship was called up to that point. Well, Hercules said, your other ship, the Tweed, has got a Tam O'Shanter figurehead. What about we stick with the theme and you go with the Cutty Sark? Oh, so Willis, I love it. The Cutty Sark. And so the Cutty Sark name was placed on the side of the ship, and the motto of Willis, which said, where there's a Willis, there's a way. 22nd of November, Captain Moore's wife smashed the bottle of champagne and the Cutty Sark was launched into the river. She was taken across the water and the masts were fitted, and then she was towed down the river and into the Clyde to Greenock, and all the ropes were fastened on and the 29 sails. And in February 1870, Captain Moore set sail for China, and for 10 years he sailed that ship. Very sadly, the clippers were going out of fashion. Clunky steamships were taking their place. They were flat-bottomed and they could go through the newly opened Suez Canal, cutting off a huge chunk of time. So the tea clippers were taken to Australia, and they became wool ships travelling from Australia to London. The Cutty Sark was a beautiful ship for a long, long time. And this is what Captain Moore said of her. She was built for me. I superintended the building and fitting of her, and I never sailed a finer ship. At 10 or 12 knots, she did not disturb the water at all. Although she was a very sharp ship, just like a yacht, her spread of canvas was enormous. She was the fastest ship of her day, a grand ship, a ship that will last forever. And if you're in Greenwich, you can still see the Cutty Sark, for there she's been restored to her full glory and worth a look. And if you can't go, you can always go virtually, because she's online as well. But what about Hercules and Marjorie, their third child just born? They lost their house. They lost every last penny that he'd saved. Well, fortunately for Hercules, his grandmother Anderson was now in Glasgow, and they went and lived with her for a time. And their eldest, Isabel, was just getting to the age where she could start her schooling. But they'd no money to send her to school, and at that time, private schools were the only decent way of getting an education for your child. Grandmother Anderson said, leave Isabel with me. You go to where you have to find work, and I will give her a good education. And Isabel did very, very well for herself. She joined a shipping company and she was there for 35 years. But Hercules, Marjorie and their two younger ones headed to Dundee, and then Aberdeen, and then down to England. And his reputation went before him because he was known as the designer of the Cutty Sark. And he became a marine architect. By the time their 10th child was born, they were in Montrose, just down the road from Inverbervie. But very sadly, a month after the last child was born, Marjorie died. She was only 37, and the family was broken-hearted. Well, the extended family rallied round, for the children were all still very young, and Hercules was able to keep working. But in 1888, his uncle William, who was now the clockmaker of the town, he died, and he left the house to Hercules. And so Hercules was able to move back home. Now, his favourite thing to do with his children was to go down to Gourdon, for there were the boats, there was the smell of fish. And he always migrated to the wee boat building yard where James was always hard at work. And he and James set up in partnership. And they got a commission to build a yacht for Loch Lomond. And when it was finished, it was put on a train, taken down to Glasgow. They made lots of wee boats, including a life-saving vessel called the Maggie Law. And if you go to Gourdon today, you can visit the museum and find out more about it. Hercules was very well respected. In 1895, he was asked to join the town council. A quiet, gentle man. And his daughter says of him that in 1900, in May, she found him in his chair by the fire, a Glasgow Herald on his knee. He died in his sleep, going out quietly the same way that he'd lived his life. And so Hercules was born and died in the same house. And if you're coming into Inverbervie, just over the Jubilee Brig, you will see for yourself the lovely monument to the Cutty Sark and to Hercules Linton. And I hope this story has given you a little bit more understanding of what this place was like way back when.